Well, welcome back to another Equipped session with Ian as we continue this, series on preaching. Been fascinating so far. If you somehow missed all the others, do go back and check them out. But today, Ian, we're going to be talking about perhaps my favourite area of preaching, actually. This is the area that I love, all around storytelling, all around illustrations. And I know that you've described this kind of area before as windows in the building, which I think is really intriguing. Give us an insight into that. Why do you call it windows in the building?
Well, Johnny, I call it windows because windows bring light. That's simply what they're there for, to bring light. And for me, the purpose of an illustration is to shed light on the text, to give us an insight, to give us personal application, the place of testimony, understanding something from a previous era of church history that helps the listener to understand and apply God's word.
I love that illustration in a sense, because it reminds me of the old stained glass windows in big Anglican churches, and you walk in and they're the most beautiful part of the building. And I think illustrations have the potential to perhaps be the most engaging part of what we talk about. And so tell us a little bit around what makes a great illustration.
Well, an illustration has to illustrate. If it takes away from the text, if it brings the focus on the preacher or something funny that happened to someone else in the congregation, it's not really doing its job. And I think we've all heard people who go into a very elaborate story and you're sat there thinking, what's that got to do with the Bible reading that we just had? That's not illustration, that's really entertainment. Illustration has to illustrate. I'll tell you something fascinating. This book is Charles Haddon Spurgeon, Lectures to My Students. Now, Charles Spurgeon lived in the Victorian era. He was an amazing preacher. Thousands of people flocked to hear him preach. Many thousands of people came to faith in Jesus. And he founded a college in London, Spurgeon's College, and he trained preachers. And he used to do lectures on preaching. And he did it extempore. He didn't have any notes. He just got up and talked. He said, my theme today is, and he went for it. And over the years, people took down notes in shorthand and then reproduced it. Now, the book here, this version of Spurgeon's lectures was published about 3 years after I was born, all right? Now, I'll get you to guess. There are 28 lectures on preaching, all right? Okay. How many lectures do you think out of 28 were dedicated to illustration?
Or if he's speaking in the 1850s, thereabouts, I'd guess zero.
Zero?
Yeah.
5.
Wow.
Spurgeon gave 5 lectures, and the titles are out of 28 lectures. And the titles were Illustrations in Preaching, Anecdotes from the Pulpit, the uses of anecdotes and illustrations, where can we find anecdotes and illustrations, the sciences as sources of illustration.
Wow. So this idea of old-fashioned preaching and it just being, just speaking bit by bit by bit by bit and leave it there actually isn't the case. Spurgeon used illustration a lot.
He did. Wow. And if you read the lectures, they're quite antiquated in language, but some of them are very, very funny. He had a great sense of humour. There's a story told that one day a lady came out, a very well-to-do lady, and said, Mr. Spurgeon, I do enjoy your preaching, but I do struggle with your use of humour. And apparently he said, Madam, if you knew how much humour I kept out of the pulpit, you'd struggle with me even more. Because he had a ready wit. He had a wonderful wit about him. But for me, in our generation, we may not use Spurgeon's illustrations, but the principles. He used to point to Jesus and said, when Jesus, he didn't teach without ever using a parable. And it was a parable that related to the people he was talking to. For me, the parables of Jesus came alive in a new way when I began to preach in India, and often going to little village churches, and in some occasions preaching in little house churches. Where you were working with an interpreter, see through. I've got to be really careful how not to get it too complicated. And suddenly the parables of Jesus came alive for me. And then I thought, hang on, that's because Jesus was Asian. And the culture in which he spoke was very similar to Indian culture today. So Spurgeon would point, and other preachers would point to Jesus' use of illustration. So we've got good precedent, and it connects if it's done well.
If it's done well.
Yes.
So let's go there then, because I think it was Andy Stanley, who's a preacher who uses illustration fantastically.
Yeah.
He wrote in one of his books around the dangers of, he calls it the dangers of the dog, I think is what he calls it, where there's the preacher who stands up and he just desperately wants to use the story of the dog, and that's kind of it. So are there those dangers with illustrations? What are they? How do we avoid them?
There are. And Andy Stanley's right. You know, you've got your favourite illustration that you use. It becomes emotive, although emotion is not bad in preaching. Sure. But it's when you're manipulating, when you're using a story just for the sake of the story, when you're using things to maybe even put yourself in a very good light. You're the hero who came to rescue at that point. There are real risks that you've got to watch out for. But there are many, many benefits. But the thing to always hold you on track is this shedding more light on the text, not light on me as a preacher, not trying to entertain, but simply wanting to use that illustration, that picture, to shed light on the passage we're looking at.
So where do you look for a great illustration? Because there's so many out there. You know, there's books, there's TV, there's films, funny stories that happen to you personally. Where's the best place?
Well, I go for what I call the 3 laws of the squirrel.
So we've got windows and squirrels.
Yes. Well, here at Moorlands, you'll know, if you look around, we've got hundreds of squirrels that sort of bounce around the grounds. And it was literally living at Moorlands one day when I was watching the squirrels in the autumn, burying their nuts, and then you watch different points in the winter time, they go and they dig them up again because it sustains them. So law number 1 of the squirrel is know a good nut when you seed one. Law number 2 is bury it. And law number 3 is know when to find it when you need it. So the squirrel sees a good nut. You and I might hear something, we might see something, we might read something in a book. Note it. Work out your own system of how you note it. Secondly, know where to find it when you need it. It's no use saying, I read something about that, but I haven't got a clue where I put it. Now, some preachers I know have got a little notebook that they keep. I have a filing system that I use. Some people just take cuttings and stick it into a file somewhere. And the third law of the squirrel is know when to find it when you need it. You know, you're preaching on faith and you think, yep, I remember that. I read in that book. And you don't just have to go to contemporary sources. Sometimes it can be from church history. There's so much rich material in history of the church. Spurgeon gives from his day the perspective he had on events that happened in church history. And the more we are reading, because all the best preachers are readers, even those who struggle with reading, all the best preachers read. When you ask them stories, where they get their stories, they'll say, I read a lot. I read anything I can, anything I can put my hands on. And all around us, there are possibilities that we can latch onto. I have a friend who is a very good preacher, very well known for his power of illustration. And I was out one day for a meal with him and 2 other preachers, and one of them said, oh, it's all right for you, you know, all these amazing things happen to you, these stories. And my friend just quietly said, well, actually, they happen to you as well. The difference is that I note them, I write them down, and I keep them. Another really good friend of mine has gone to be with the Lord now, who used to say to me, he was always walking around with a book, a notebook. And I said to him, Rob, why do you walk around with that notebook in your hand wherever you go? He said, because ideas are shy. And he was a writer as well as a speaker. And he said, I know that if I hear something or see something or read something, I need to write it down. So 3 laws of the squirrel. Know a good nut when you see one. Know how to bury it and know how to find it when you need it.
I love that. Ideas are shy. That's going to stick with me. That's such a beautiful phrase. So how do you tell a story well then? Because it's easy to know an illustration, it's easy to bury it, pull it back up.
Yeah.
But actually we've all heard people who can butcher a story. And there is nothing more painful than thinking, if I told this story, this would be how I'd say. And
I know.
it almost pulls me back to when you had that initial conversation with Chris at the very beginning of this series around Michael McIntyre and how he could really pull out that kind of material. How do you tell a good story?
Well, I'll use a real life illustration. I was working with a guy in my church who was part of our leadership team, and he was learning to preach, just beginning. But bless him, he was in that mode of reading an essay, and he had no illustrations at all, none, all the way through. So when we were sitting down doing a debrief, he's a sailor, an amateur sailor, pretty good one. So I said to him, Andy, what's the most frightening thing that's happened to you when you've been sailing? And he told me this horrendous story where he had to call the Coast Guard. He thought he was going to lose his life. He was sailing solo. Wow. And he made several cardinal mistakes. And it was one of those life-changing moments that when he went out on a boat again, he never, and in teaching sailing, don't ever do this. Do you know, as he was talking to me, I was sweating because I felt as if I was on the boat with him. So I said, right, next time you're up preaching, which I think it was the next month, you're going to tell that story. Oh, how do I fit it in? I said, well, let's talk together about a passage we can find. The disciples in the boat with Jesus fast asleep and a storm comes. I want you to use that story and I don't want you to read it. I just want you to tell it like it is, like you've just told me. And he did. And the impact was extraordinary because, like the disciples, he feared for his life. And I tell you, he did it so well, we all felt we were in the boat with the disciples. You know, it was that ability. But you do that by crafting it. And you and I know when something funny has happened to us, you told me about something funny that happened to you yesterday. Over time, we sort of polish it and it gets to be quite precise. And therefore, to tell an illustration well, in order for it to look natural, you need to polish it, not embellish it, but polish it so that you've got it right and you cut out the extraneous stuff, but you get to the heart of what it's saying.
There's a fantastic Instagram account that takes videos of celebrities telling stories and telling anecdotes on chat shows, but the way in which they cut it up is fascinating because they take one story that they share, but they cut it up from different shows that they've shared the same story on. And so you can see them sitting in one place and they'll be in another place and they'll be in another place, but the story will be told fluidly. And it's amazing because if you were to listen to it at one time, you think, oh, that's a funny story, whether you knew you were going to share that or not, that's great, really well told. But they've obviously crafted it so well. You know, they've told it in front of friends, they've, recited it in their heads, they've told it in front of the mirror so that when it comes to whatever chat show they're on, it looks so natural. They don't need to rely on notes and bullet points. It's their story and it feels like you're there with them.
The master of that was Tony Campolo. And I've worked with Tony a bit over the years. Don't agree with all his theology, but I've heard him use the same illustration again and again and again, and it lives because he's polished it.
So to finish up then, Ian, what's helped you most in this area of illustration?
Well, do you know, I struggled with illustration. I look back at some of my early preaching notes and realised that, it wasn't very good. And people who listened to me would say it wasn't very good. But something happened that appeared to be random, but was really of God. I was asked if I would write a weekly column for a newspaper. I was down in the southwest. Western Morning News is the main daily newspaper down there. And they said, will you write a weekly column on some aspect of life and faith? And that's quite a challenge. And I said to the editor, look, I'll do it on the condition that as soon as I run out of things to say, I can withdraw, gracefully. And so every Friday afternoon at 4:00, I had a deadline. I had to get 400 words in, and it had to be precisely 400 words. And I did it for 10 years. But what it did was it taught me the discipline of listening and reading. And sometimes on a Friday afternoon, I'd sit down at my laptop and say, don't know what I'm going to do, Lord, help. And something from a conversation that week or something I'd read in the paper that week would come to mind. There were some amazing things because I was writing at the time when Princess Diana was killed in a car crash. The Queen Mother passed away suddenly. Different things happen where you get a call from the editor, particularly with the Queen Mother. I remember he said, "We want you to do a double-page spread on how do we react to someone passing away who's loved." And I just had to come up with that. By 10 o'clock that night, they gave me an extension on my deadline. But that taught me the importance of walking through life with my eyes and my ears open. And going back to where we started, Jesus did it. And therefore, if he was the great master of preaching, I should be looking and listening for the kind of illustration that will help people understand more about God and the kingdom of God.
So there we go then, illustrations are key. Why not start writing some notes where you can write down some of the stories that you have in your back pocket. Maybe write down the 3 stories you love telling most and start thinking, why is it that those stories are the stories that you hold on to most? And what is it about telling those stories that brings you the most energy as well? And maybe apply that to some of the other stories that start rising up within your life when you read and when you start living your life too. Do let us know what you're finding most helpful out of these sessions. We do love to hear from you as always. But until next time, have a great one and look out for those illustrations.